Mirrors by Greensearcher. Chapter 21. Maman! The Queen hummed tiredly, rolling over where she lay. Maman, wake up! Sighing, Jacqueline opened her eyes. She lay in a bed of grass, surrounded by Alexander's gardens, squinting against the sun overhead. Adam? She asked, sitting up in an instant and looking around in confusion. Maman, you fell asleep, he said in amusement. She looked towards him, but the 9-year-old prince faced away from her, staring towards the woods. Why did they seem so distant? Grinning, he glanced over his shoulder. Can I show you something? Before she could respond, he had taken off in a run towards the trees. Jacqueline stood, picking up her skirt and following quickly. Down 100 stone steps, winding through a dozen courtyard paths. The skies were growing dark, the grounds abandoned of life. Where had he gotten so quickly? She reached an archway, pulling open the old iron gate and casting her eyes ahead desperately. Her skin was suddenly freezing, wind whipping through her hair. Adam! She called out. Adam, where are you? A voice, small and distant, came from behind her. Yet when she turned around, she saw nothing but empty castle grounds. Mama, I'm right here! She turned back ahead, where Adam now stood a ways off. He waved at her from the edge of the woods, before ducking behind a large tree. The skies were black now, snow beginning to fall around. Adam, wait! She cried, rushing forth as he disappeared into the darkness. Her feet felt like ice, and she looked down at them, bare and in inches of the snow, as she ran. Gasping, she looked ahead once again. The trees were upon her now, her child already well into the forest depths. Adam! She shouted in panic. Adam, stop! He did, finally, waiting as still as stone atop a fallen tree. She pushed through the heavy growth, panting and cold. When she finally reached him, she reached up and grabbed his wrist. Adam, we must go back to the... Her words died in her throat as he looked back at her. His eyes shone red in the darkness, a terrible smile crossing the child's face. Hello, Jacqueline, he spoke. Gasping, the Queen released his hand, taking several trembling steps back. It's you! She realized in terror. Adam's form licked his lips before slowly changing. His hair grew longer and lighter, body taller and more feminine, until the enchantress towered over her in the darkness. Wolves howled somewhere far too close, and Jacqueline turned towards the sound in fear. The enchantress laughed, stepping gracefully from the tall log. That was too easy, she grinned. Funny, the real prince wasn't far behind us. Jacqueline searched the darkness with wide eyes. Which way back? She wandered desperately. The journey here hadn't felt far, but she didn't recognize anything with the storm now raging all around them. Her heart grew cold as ice, realizing what had seemed a strange dream before was now a very real and a very dangerous situation. The howls were close now. Well, that's my cue, the witch said. She turned towards the frozen pond at her side, crouching down and touching its surface with one thin finger. The eyes shuddered briefly, and the reflection surrounding the trees disappeared. Jacqueline's eyes grew wide. She knew what that meant. The enchantress was about to leave her here, alone with the wolves. And she knew she'd never outrun them alone. Wait! She cried desperately. Please, Ugh, the witch said, waving her hand to cut her off. Spare me your tears. Your life means nothing to me. The fewer of your kind in this world, the better. And with you out of my way. She stopped, grinning to herself, pressing her palm flat against the ice and watching it glow. Jacqueline gasped for breath, mind racing. She thought of Alexander, of the last kiss they had shared, soft and quiet, and full of the love of a decade. But even more, she thought of Adam, still so young, still so unaware of the hardships of this world. Sucking in a breath, she fell to her knees in the snow. I would not beg for my own life, enchantress. She bowed her head. But please, Do not make me abandon my child. The enchantress froze, hand still hovering over the ice. Then she turned back slowly, breaths hollow, eyes glazed over, as though recalling something from long ago. I need you gone, she whispered, even as she furrowed her brows. Please, Jacqueline begged. I can't leave him. The enchantress hissed, looking away. Damn it, she spat. I can't deal with this right now. Clenching her teeth, she brought 2 hands to her temples, sharp nails running through her hair. Then, with a noise of frustration, she crouched back beside the pond and slapped a palm against its surface. A deep, ink-like substance seemed to leak from her fingertips, running along the edge of the pond. Though black, it somehow glowed against the surrounding forest. Jacqueline started as a hard hand grabbed her arm. The enchantress was at her side, staring down at her with fury. Yet Jacqueline possessed the gift of reading beneath the surface of those she met. In an instant, she saw past the witch's rage. For the way her red eyes shook revealed a strange and unexpected vulnerabilities. I hate these woods, the witch rasped, almost to herself. She frowned deeply, squeezing her eyes shut for a long moment before sucking in a breath and dragging the queen to her feet. In a second, she had torn a long strip from Jacqueline's hem. In another, she sliced her sharp nails across the queen's palm and pressed the torn cloth against it. Jacqueline cried out in pain, gripping her hand against her chest and watching the witch toss the bloodied cloth into the ground. She dug a sharp heel against it, burying it deep in the snow. We'll leave that for Alexander, the witch huffed, staring back at Jacqueline with sharp eyes. Now get in, she demanded, shoving Jacqueline towards the glowing pond. Jacqueline hovered at the edge, reaching out for a low branch to avoid falling into the icy water. Where will it send me? She asked in fear. Clinging to the thin trees on the bank with one frozen hand, the other dripping blood down her dress. I can't have you here. Not now, the witch replied vaguely, but perhaps I'll find a use for you later. She stopped, backing up and nodding towards the glowing water. So, she went on, if you don't want to be eaten by wolves, and if you want any chance to see your precious son again, you'll do as I say. The trees rustled behind them. Jacqueline whipped her head at the sound. The witch followed her gaze, suddenly looking nervous herself. Ah! She cried impatiently. I don't have time to wait for you. Reaching into her robes, she dropped something into the snow. A tall, thin object flew towards the treetops, and a moment later she had passed through it and disappeared. Jacqueline heard the growls then, spinning around as her eyes tore into the darkness. 2, then 4 yellow, hungry eyes stared back at her. She pulled hard on the branch she held onto, tearing it from its trunk. Holding it aloft, she ignored the blood and pain and swung with all her might. The pair of wolves backed away. Yet, as they did so, a dozen more eyes appeared. Jacqueline couldn't breathe. She knew, right then, that she was as good as dead if she stayed. She stared back at the dark, glowing waters behind her, and sucked in a brave breath. Goodbye, Alexander, my love, she whispered. Goodbye, my darling Adam. And then, stepping onto the ice, she sunk into their depths and vanished. Jacqueline gasped for breath. The darkness of the night was gone in an instant, a bright winter sun shining overhead. She raised a hand against the harsh rays, letting her eyes adjust to her surroundings. She was still in the woods, still frozen to the bone. She looked down. Her feet were ankle deep in the pond, which was now much smaller than before, and no longer frozen. Glancing around, she spotted the large fallen tree from before, though it seemed more hollow, more broken down than the night before. She forced her feet to move, but only made it to the bank before dropping to her knees. Breathing heavily, she stared at her hands, her heart flying into her throat at the sight. Her fingers, something was wrong with them. Though she still wore her wedding band, her hands seemed more wrinkled, nails far too long. Her dark hair rested beside them, pooled in the snow, and speckled with long slivers of grey. Frowning, she lifted her injured hand, fearing infection. But when she turned the palm to face her, she gasped. There was no blood. In fact, there was nothing but a faint white line along the skin. "What is this?" she whispered, looking in confusion at her chemise. Down the front were dark brown stains, not fresh red as the blood should have been after so short a time. She rested back on her heels, pulling her arms to her chest and shivering like mad. "I need to get back," she realized, looking around the woods. Though day, they seemed even more unfamiliar to her than they had the night before. Taking in several deep breaths, she braced herself against the closest tree and forced herself to her feet. "Alexander! Adam!" she whispered. "I'm coming."
Belle.
Belle groaned, shifting where she slept. Papers crinkled beneath her, back aching where she sat hunched over the long library table.
"Belle, wake up!"
She gasped. That voice! It was a bit higher. Yes, less raspy than it had once been, but she'd know it anywhere. She sat up in a heartbeat, casting her eyes towards its source. A man stood at the threshold, framed by the tall library doors. He took a step into the light. Light auburn hair, bright blue eyes, a nervous yet familiar smile. "Adam?" Belle breathed, though somehow she didn't need to ask how to know. Pushing herself up and tumbling towards him. Already at her side, he caught her quickly, lifting her up and off her feet. He grinned, then spun her around once before letting her back down. He was tall, the strength of his former self not entirely gone as he held her close, and brushed soft fingers across her cheek. "How are you here?" Belle asked, blinking back tears of relief. Adam pulled back, cocking his head.
"What do you mean, my love?"
The room grew suddenly dark. The witch!" Belle said, gripping his shirt hard, the terrible wind now pounding against the windows. "She took you!"
"She did?" Adam asked, looking alarmed.
The windows flew open behind them, pummeling them with freezing rain. Rain and a dozen heavy gold chains. They wound up and around his limbs in an instant. That tight shackle around his neck once again. "No!" Belle shrieked, clinging to him with all her might. Yet it wasn't enough, for he was quickly torn from her grasp and dragged into the cold, dark, empty night sky. The last thing she saw were his eyes, wide and desperate, and frightened.
"Mademoiselle?"
"Mademoiselle?" "Adam!" Belle sobbed. The darkness was all around her, and like a heavy blanket it engulfed her, forcing her to the ground. "Someone shake her awake!" Gentle hands touched her shoulders then, and Belle gasped, opening her eyes. She sat in the library, as before, but the windows were secured shut, pale sunlight spilling inside instead of the rain. She squinted her eyes against the light, blinking away tears. She heard a whine beside her, looking down to see Max paw in her lap and nudging her nervously. "Belle, are you all right?" a familiar voice asked. Sophie sat beside her, curls now cropped to her shoulders and pulled away from her eyes with a thick ribbon. She bit her lip and reached for Belle's hands. You cried out?" Belle sighed, sitting up slowly, letting her face fall into one hand. "I'm sorry. I must have dozed off and—" She trailed off, noticing a few others lingering nearby with their own looks of concern. Belle swallowed, flushing in embarrassment. "Shoo! Shoo!" Sophie said, waving them away. Belle looked back down. She sat at one of the long library tables. No less than 3 dozen books lay scattered before her, as well as a handful of sketches and several pieces of parchment full of messy notes. She'd started 3 nights ago in her bedclothes and slippers, surrounded by the others, and starting with clear questions. She asked the mirror whether Adam was in France, to which the mist had appeared again. She asked if he weren't in Europe, in Africa, in the Americas, listing every continent, region and territory they could spot on the library globe. Giles had reminded them of how the Prussian princess the witch had impersonated so long ago was found on a small remote island. So she'd tried that. Was Adam on an isle in the sea? Was he in a cave? On a mountain? In the desert? Travelling in a caravan? A carriage? A ship? Yet with each question, she only saw that strange, relentless mist. Adam's old tutor had even suggested she try asking a way to see locations a specified distance away from Adam, in hopes the mirror was only restricted details of the exact location itself. "Show me the place 10 loos south of Adam," she tried, growing hopeful at the idea. If they could identify the locations around him, it would take a few simple measurements to pinpoint exactly where he was. Yet, of course, the mirror would not comply. 20 loos! Belle tried next. 30! Yet any question she asked about him, no matter how it was worded, resulted in a blank mirror, and even blanker stares from those around her. "It's all right," Belle had said aloud, even through her own disappointment. She had figured it would be more difficult than this, but she had been hopeful all the same. Sucking in a breath, she looked back at those who had joined her in the library. "I just need you all to tell me everything you know about the Enchantress." It was the next best place to start, and soon Belle had created several sketches of the woman. The first was of her own memory, of her from that very evening, monstrous and young, and donned in a blood-red gown. This version seemed very familiar to that described by those who had caught sight of the Enchantress the night the curse was first cast, though no one had mentioned the strange transparent skin Belle had noticed. Still, unlike her usual sketches of people, Belle paid less attention to the witch's physical appearance, and more the state of her dress. Given the woman could change her face and body, it seemed more helpful to focus on her choice of attire, and as the images came to life, they started pulling down volumes of text on regional fashion. This alone revealed something surprising. The gowns she wore had a bodice layered unlike anything seen in France, but very much like the robes worn in China.
"She did call herself the Enchantress of the East," Giles recalled. "But then again, she also told the king he had harmed her as a child, somehow, suggesting she was of French origin."
Beyond her clothes, they investigated her eyes.
"It isn't albinism,"
the doctor explained. He sat with Belle at the long table, along with Giles, Mrs. Potts, Adam's old tutor, Sophie, Cogsworth, Lumiere, and even the Cardinal.
"Those with this condition may appear to have pink eyes at most," Matthias went on. "Nothing like the red you described, mademoiselle. If anything, I would diagnose broken blood vessels in her eyes. But it seems more mystical than that. Something inhuman, perhaps."
"Wait a minute," Sophie said. She looked across the table, where Henry and Chip were sitting before a large open atlas. She leaned closer to the others, lowering her voice. "Henry mentioned something he heard that frightened him away from coming here." Belle frowned. "What was it?" Sophie looked back at Henry and Chip once more. "He wouldn't want Chip to hear. It was quite violent." In hushed tones, Sophie told them the tale from Henry's old master, of his young nephew found dead in an alleyway, heart torn from his chest in such a way no animal, nor human, could have been capable of. Belle gasped, and Sophie turned towards her quickly. "Oh, Belle, I'm so sorry. I'm sure the master is in no danger of such a thing." "It's not that," Belle said quickly. She looked up at Giles, who was staring at her like he had come to the same conclusion. "It's just... that's incredibly similar to the tale the Enchantress told me when we first met." The tale of a beast, stealing into a damsel's room and pulling the heart from her chest. A tale Belle had never imagined would be based on something real. You really think it was her, then? Sophie asked, her eyes growing wide. You think she... She trailed off, clearly unwilling to speak of the horrifying deed again. Belle stared at the dark wooden table for a long moment, then nodded. I do. How can we use this?
There should be records of such cases, the old tutor said gruffly. If any other strange occurrences in the area, I believe it would be worth investigating.
Belle nodded earnestly. Let's continue our research there, then.
Perhaps the cases will reveal some kind of pattern to our travels, she thought. Perhaps they can lead us to where she's keeping Adam. Will you be looking into this yourself, mademoiselle?
The tutor asked. Belle looked back at the mirror, still resting at the centre of the table. Actually, could you oversee that, Professor? I have something else I'd like to try in the meantime. As the others departed to investigate, Belle picked up the mirror once again and spoke. Show me Adam, she asked. As expected, nothing but a light mist appeared in its surface. But for the first time, it was what she had been wanting to see. Reaching for her drawing utensils, which the others had kindly retrieved from the wagon she had abandoned, along with the rest of her possessions, Belle pulled aside a fresh parchment and copied the mists, focusing on their shape, noting their movements and speeds in the margin. Then she pulled out her watercolours and mixed some together, testing the mixture several times against a scratch piece of parchment until it matched the colour of the mists exactly. She painted a good swath of it beside her notes. Setting her brush aside, Belle stood and ran to the large desk where the library's handwritten indices, old and new, sat high. After some confusion, she decided on one labelled Natural Philosophy. It was less dense than the other records, but within an hour she had located 3 texts that might offer what she needed. While the number of books on the topic were few, the texts themselves were thick and dense. Belle struggled through them for some time. The sciences were not something she had read much of anything about before, and the style and terminology was unfamiliar to her. While Papa had owned a couple of books of the sort, the things they described were more mechanical than natural. She wished, absently, that Adam were here to help. She had caught him with his head in these kind of books on more than one occasion. Though, of course, if he were here, they wouldn't be doing this. By late afternoon, she had managed to locate several useful passages, poring over them for some time and adding more information to her notes. Finally, as some of the servants started lighting candles to illuminate the now dark library, Belle looked back over her work, now filled with several more sketches and colour patches of the mirror's mists she had painted over the course of the day. They had shown a very distinct daily pattern, a pattern in which the mists fell still at some hours and blew hard at others, that they changed from a pale grey colour to a state where they nearly disappeared into the darkness. Belle stared at the drawings, thinking back over all she had learnt that day. Her heart raced, and she realised her suspicions had been confirmed. This was no mystical, unexplainable mist. It was nothing but a natural fog, and it was their first clue in finding Adam. Belle? Belle bit her lip hard, staring absently at her hands. Clouds form on ocean-facing mountainsides, she told herself, trying to recall everything she had managed to read on the subject. Fog is nothing more than low-lying cloud, often found in deep mountainside valleys. To persist all day, and without break, they must have a constant supply of water or moisture that can be penetrated, but not suffocated by sunlight. Belle, are you all right? Blinking, Belle looked up. Sophie was still beside her, looking even more concerned than she was before. Belle had completely forgotten that she was there. How long had she been lost in thought? I'm sorry, she said quickly, shaking her head. I stayed up with the professor much of last night, looking through several atlases. They had looked through over a dozen, in fact, in search of any locations that could possibly support a never-ceasing fog. Last night? Sophie asked, frowning. Belle, when was the last time you slept? You should rest, Sophie said, Just for the afternoon, at least. Oh, no, Belle said, shaking her head. I'm fine for now. Belle, it's been nearly 3 days. And you never fully recovered from your night in the woods, Sophie said anxiously. Not to mention touched your breakfast, someone added. Belle looked up, and there was Mrs. Potts, resting a hand on her shoulder and looking pointedly at a bowl of untouched porridge atop the sack of parchment. Belle grimaced. Love, Mrs. Potts went on gently, let the others continue for now, and get some good sleep. I am sleeping, Belle insisted, motioning towards a nearby sofa, where a couple of mangled pillows, Adam's robe, and a pair of small slippers sat unattended. I meant in a real bed, dear, Mrs. Potts clarified. No, Mel said matter-of-factly, looking back at the pile of books she had fallen over. The west wing is on the opposite side of the castle. It's too far to traverse back and forth, she went on, eyes wide and unblinking as they continued to scan the page before her. I thought you might say so, and, as such, we've prepared you a room in the next hall over. Belle bit her lip, mind grasping for any other excuse. But her thoughts were moving much slower than normal, so instead she simply turned back to the next text before her and hoped Mrs. Potts might simply give up. Yet her eyes didn't seem to want to focus as they should. It seemed Mrs. Potts wouldn't give up so easily anyway, for she soon settled in the chair beside her. She reached out, resting a hand over Belle's own, pulling the quill from her fingertips and resting it back in its jar. Dear, you must let yourself rest, Mrs. Potts said softly. Belle felt the pressure behind her eyes, so she squeezed them shut. Tears would only blur her vision faster. I can't, Mrs. Potts, she admitted. Every moment I waste is a moment Adam has to... She trailed off. A moment he has to what? Suffer a terrible transformation alone? Suffer whatever terrible things the Enchantress had planned for him? She shook her head roughly. How can I rest when he's still in her power? Belle asked, shaking her head roughly. No, I can't. And I'm sorry about the porridge, she added, thoughts growing absent again. Mrs. Potts patted her hand while Sophie wrapped a gentle arm around her shoulders. We understand. But just think, she said, raising her finger. A nice nap and a walk in the sunshine. It'll get your mind back to full speed. You'll get twice as much done as you can right now. Belle looked back, the words on the page before her. Still fuzzy. Perhaps a small nap would be helpful, she admitted. And a walk. Belle nodded. And a brisk walk, but that's it. Of course, love, Mrs. Potts winked. 4 hours later, Belle awoke to another nightmare. She still felt Adam's arms all around her. That terrible burning heat that caused him to tremble as he clung to her with weak arms and fought the agony of his transformation. Belle squeezed her eyes shut, but couldn't stop the quiet tear that fell down her cheek. I should be with you, she whispered, heart aching at the thought of him alone in such pain. Her regrets drove her now as she quickly got up and redressed. Despite her stubbornness earlier, Belle had to give Mrs. Potts credit. She did feel better. She was back to the library in a few minutes, settling down at the desk and looking over her mess of notes that had, thankfully, been left untouched. Ah, Belle, a voice said behind her. Ready for that walk, then? She grimaced, turning around to see Sir Giles standing straight as a board at her side. Oh, right, she said, pursing her lips, then went on. You don't think we could not and say we did, do you, Giles? She attempted her best and most innocent smile. I fibbed to Mrs. Potts once, he replied. He grimaced, be it ever so slightly. It did not end well for me. Belle raised a brow, terribly curious at what that could mean, but instead she took the opportunity to slip a few notes into her satchel and sling it over her shoulder. Well, let's be off then. The promised walk turned into a ride. If we ride, we can go the same distance in less time. Mrs. Potts doesn't need to know I went on horseback after all, Belle thought, though, in truth, she was anxious to see Philippe now that she had been forced outside the castle. For while she knew the others were tending to him, she felt some guilt for not going to see him once he had nearly frozen to death in the woods on her behalf. Philippe was apt to hold a grudge, but perhaps he sensed Belle's distress, for he only drooped a grateful head over her shoulder in greeting. Belle soon felt another nudge against her back, turning around to see Olive in the next stall. The mare stared at Belle for a long moment, then turned back, hanging her head over her gate and looking towards the door, as though expecting someone to appear. It took Belle great effort not to burst into tears on the spot, for she knew exactly who Olive was waiting to see. And he wasn't coming. Sucking in a breath, she turned back to Philippe. "You need to rest some more, huh?" she asked. He gave a reluctant huff, and Belle turned back towards Adam's horse. "How does a ride sound, Olive?" The horse perked up at that, so Belle quickly saddled her and began to guide her to the castle. "Belle!" someone cried. She looked up, where Chip was watching her from his father's arms. Beside them stood a tall horse with a deep black coat. "Belle, I got my own horse! And he lets me pet him!" Chip said in excitement, managing to lift one arm and place a weak hand on the horse's side. Henry reached up to help him brush his hand back and forth. In response, the stallion turned back and nuzzled Chip's cheek. The boy giggled with delight. Belle smiled at the sight, even as she furrowed her brows in confusion. "Henry, that horse—" He looked a bit sheepish. "Oh, do you know him, Belle?" She nodded slowly. I'm quite certain it belonged to Gaston." Henry's eyes grew dark. "That boss—" He stopped, remembering his 10-year-old son was listening, and coughed roughly into one fist. "I mean, that seems about right. You think it's all right if we keep him here? Poor fella had a rough go of it with that bloke, it seems." It was then that Belle caught sight of the long bandages wrapped around the horse's belly. She moved over and ran her fingers through the animal's mane. "He wasn't very nice to you, either, was he?" she whispered. The horse leaned into her strokes, closing his eyes. "Yes," she said at last. "I definitely think he should stay here." "Do you know his name, Belle?" Chip asked. She smiled a bit, looking back at him. "I believe it was Magnifique," Belle replied, "though that seems a bit too formal to me." Chip said, pursing his lips. Then his eyes brightened. "What if I call him Maggie?"
Henry chuckled. "Sounds fine by me."
A quarter-hour later, Belle and Giles were a good ways into the woods.
"Ah,"
Giles said, slowing his own steed to the place Belle had stopped.
"I admit, it's quite refreshing to be the rider instead of the sword."
Belle glanced towards the ridge just ahead. "I'd like to explore by foot for a while," she said. "Will you stay with Olive?"
"Of course," he replied, "but don't veer too far."
Falling to her feet, Belle pulled her satchel from the saddlebags and handed the reins to Giles. Then, climbing up and over the short ridge, she spotted an old fallen tree tucked into the shadows. Belle sat promptly, pulling the satchel to her lap and tugging out her notes and the enchanted mirror. For in truth she had no intention of exploring anything but these clues to finding Adam. She looked over her sketches of that fog. A dozen of them, piled in her lap, each a slightly different colour. Some completely black altogether, while some were as light as the midday sky. Belle closed her eyes, pressing her fingers against her temples as she thought. "Wait a minute," she said at last, spreading the pages across her lap. Naturally, the colours grew lighter and darker, following the pattern of the sun. This, of course, only supported her theory that these were a natural phenomenon. But this wasn't all they told her. The sun sets at different times around the world, she recalled, heart racing. If they knew what time the fog in the mirror grew dark, that could line up with the sunset and narrow down Adam's location significantly. Heart racing, Belle looked over her notes and grimaced. She hadn't written down the times of each drawing. In fact, she'd been so focused on her work she'd hardly paid attention to whether it was night or day when she'd done the sketches. I'll redo them, she thought fiercely. I'll redo them, take careful note of the time. Then, with the professor's help, we can help determine the approximate longitude of the Earth where... Something rustled in the trees, breaking her thoughts. Belle's head snapped up, squinting in the shadows, until she caught a figure emerging slowly from the brush. Belle slipped behind the fallen tree where she sat, anxious not to be spotted by a passing stranger. For while the others were human once again, they'd decided not to announce themselves to the world just yet. Such would only be an invitation for King Victor to come and stake his claim of the palace. Holding her breath, Belle watched the stranger hobble slowly to her direction. She soon made out a woman's figure, and as she came closer, Belle realized she was barefoot and covered in dried blood. Sacre bleu! Belle gasped, abandoning all caution as she stood and rushed over quickly. Madame! She cried, tugging off her cloak and draping the heavy fabric over the woman's shoulders. Madame, are you... Belle stopped, heart in her throat as the woman looked up at her. Those eyes! Those were Adam's eyes! Mademoiselle, the woman breathed, eyes closing as she gripped Belle's arm with a weak, trembling hand. Please, I need to reach the palace. The palace? Belle repeated in shock. Before she could say more, the woman's legs gave out and she collapsed in her arms. Madame! Belle cried, holding her close and slowly lowering them both to the ground. Sucking in a breath, she turned back to the trail. Sir Giles! She called. Giles, please, help us! He was already running towards them, dropping to the ground and helping Belle support the woman. Belle, what's... He stopped, eyes growing wide as the woman looked up at him. Oh, Giles, she breathed in relief. Thank goodness. Giles only stared at her, unbreathing for a long moment. It can't be, he whispered at last. Alexander. The woman went on, closing her eyes again. Adam, I fear they're in danger. The enchantress, she was here. She trailed off, fatigue overcoming her and leaving her unconscious in their arms. Giles remained motionless, staring at the woman in utter shock. Belle, for her part, could barely comprehend what had just been said. But there wasn't time to think on such things now. Giles, she said earnestly, we have to get her back. He shook his head roughly, staring back at Belle for an instant before nodding. Yes, of course. Forgive me, he said, tearing off his own cloak and carefully wrapping the woman's frozen legs and feet before lifting her up into his arms. They ran back to their horses, and Belle helped settle the woman in Giles' lap before lifting herself into her own saddle. They rode swiftly against the growing shadows, and Belle watched Giles ahead, the woman's long, dark hair flowing in the wind. The ride back let her think, sent her heart racing again at what she had heard. This woman. She had spoken of the enchantress, and King Alexander. More than that, she had spoken of Adam, and looked at Belle with his very eyes. Belle's heart thundered in her chest at one conclusion flooded her thoughts. That's impossible, she told herself, gripping the reins hard as she followed them through the front gates. Giles was already on the ground, racing up the steps, and Belle followed. People were shouting, others catching sight of the woman and crying out in shock as Giles passed her to a stronger servant. Could it be? One of them gasped, Is it she? Belle watched in some helplessness as the woman was rushed to a nearby room, as Mrs. Potts and Madame de la Grande-Bouche and the doctor and half a dozen other women rushed inside. The door finally shut behind them, leaving Belle staring at it in shock. Slowly, she reached into her satchel, tugging out the beautiful sketchbook she had kept by her side, and turned to one of its pages. A sketch of Adam and his parents, mimicked from one of the castle paintings. The likeness of his mother stared up at her. The very face of the woman behind those doors. Someone was beside her. Giles, folding his quaking hands before his back, staring down at the sketch in Belle's hands. It's her, isn't it? She asked hollowly, looking up at him.
Yes, he stated.
He looked back at the closed doors and took a deep breath.
It seems our queen has returned to us.
The next morning, Belle sat once again in the library. She held a drawing compass in one hand, several careful measurements drawn on the map before her. In theory, the light and dark periods of the mirror's fog should line up with the sun's rise and fall, and using this, she was quite certain she could determine at least the longitude slice of the earth where Adam must be. Yet, of course, this task was far too arduous for Belle at the moment. Those few who remained in the library were even more distracted than herself, whispering in the corners and glancing towards the door every few minutes. I can't believe it's her, Belle thought for the 100th time. Adam's mother. Alive? Her heart sunk into her chest as she realised that he wasn't even here to see her. Sucking in a breath, Belle tried to focus again on her work. The sooner we find him, the sooner they can be reunited. The door creaked open and her head shut up, but it was only the old professor returning to the room. Belle sighed, distracted again. What will she think of me? She wondered. From what she could tell, Jacqueline had no recollection of a day since her supposed death. To her, Adam should still be a 9-year-old child. Would she accept that he was now fully grown? That Belle loved him? That because of her, he was gone?
Belle, don't think for a moment that this is your fault.
Belle remembered his words, touching her chest where Adam's letter was tucked against her heart. She squeezed her eyes shut.
Belle?
Yes? She asked quickly, looking up again. It was Giles.
Queen Jacqueline wishes to speak with you,
he said. Me? Belle asked. Why was she so nervous? She shook her head. I mean, how is she doing?
She is well,
Giles said. He still appeared unsettled, though more composed than before.
Not including the last few hours. She recalls nothing since the night she vanished. Dr. Matthias believes it's a case of amnesia.
Belle frowned. But how did she get here then? She wondered aloud. And all those years ago? You searched the forest for days, didn't you? Where could she have gone?
Giles stopped, eyes growing nervous again. Nowhere, he answered. There was nowhere she could have gone. We combed that forest through, searched every village in the province, and beyond. Perhaps someone stole her away, but it seems impossible they could have escaped us. Every soldier was searching within an hour of Prince Adam's last sighting of her. Impossible, he gasped, shaking his head. It's impossible.
They continued down the corridor, reaching the room within which the Queen had quickly settled into and cared for. Belle entered quietly. Giles followed, shutting the door and standing there in silence. Beside the bed sat Mrs. Potts, who, upon seeing Belle enter, turned and smiled. A strange smile, like she herself was still in complete bewilderment at what was happening. The woman in the bed caught sight of Belle, and her eyes brightened. You are Belle, she said earnestly, beckoning her over. The one my son loves, no? Belle blinked, staring at her in surprise. She stepped over slowly. Please, forgive me for not calling you sooner, the Queen said, sitting up further as Belle sat carefully on the edge of the bed. Mrs. Potts explained everything, but I admit, it's quite a lot to take in.
To think it's been so long. To think he's now a man.
She stopped, swallowing roughly, looking quite close to tears. In fact, now that Belle was beside her, she noticed Jacqueline's eyes were lined with red. No doubt she had been crying already. In fact, the way the Queen's eyes were wrinkled in grief, the fold in her brow, it was so similar to Adam's expression that Belle couldn't help the way her breath caught at the sight of it. She reached tentatively for her hand, and Jacqueline didn't pull away. You really are lovely, the Queen said, and intelligent, and so kind. Even if Mrs. Potts hadn't told me, I could tell already. It's no wonder he loves you. Belle flushed. She had heard Jacqueline had a special way of lifting those around her, but it still surprised her. She smiled, feeling much more at ease. Please, would you tell me about him? The Queen went on. I believe you must know him best. Oh, Belle said in surprise. Oh, yes, of course, Your Majesty. No, she said firmly, squeezing Belle's hand. No, you must call me Jacqueline. Belle stared at her, feeling a strange sense of déjà vu and an accompanying memory.
Belle, no more master, please.
Well, all right then. Just Adam it is. It felt so long ago, but Belle recalled it like it had happened yesterday. She nodded, feeling a new warmth towards the woman beside her. Suddenly realizing Adam was who he was, at least in part, because of her. Suddenly feeling like a small part of him was still here. Belle sensed the others depart from the room, and she began to speak. She started from the beginning, of Adam's gift to her father, and how she had found this place and learned of this curse on its occupants. She hesitated as she approached her growing relationship with Adam, but Jacqueline seemed so anxious to hear all she could of him that Belle couldn't help but go on. Some time later, Jacqueline sat with Belle's notebook in her lap.
Beautiful,
she said, turning the page.
This was his form, then?
Belle nodded. Jacqueline stared at it for a long moment, a look of hurt, or perhaps regret, crossing her face. However, soon she managed to smile, resting her fingers carefully beside the drawing.
I can tell it's him, in a way.
He looks happy, she sighed, closing the book and looking towards the window.
Matthias says I have amnesia, she went on, but I just can't believe it. My clothes were just the same as the other night, or what I recall being the other night.
She stopped, looking down and staring into her lap.
My queen,
Giles went on quietly. He had returned some minutes before, now standing guard in the shadows.
May I offer some insight?
Please, Sir Giles, Jacqueline said earnestly. He stepped forward slowly.
When the king and I located the Prussian princess, it felt similar, he said, despite having been missing for months. Found on a remote island hundreds of leagues away from her homeland. Her clothing was unsoiled. Not a hair out of place. It shouldn't have been possible.
Jacqueline stared at him. What does this mean? She breathed. They stared in silence for a long minute. Across the room, Giles frowned deeply, while beside Belle, the Queen breathed deeply and stared at her hands. The enchantress uses mirrors to travel between locations, Belle said, thinking aloud, pulling the enchanted mirror from her waist. Just like this mirror can show us different places. Jacqueline watched her in some puzzlement, but didn't speak. This was Adam's, Belle explained. It can show us anything in the world. But it's not just that. I recently learned it can show me different times as well. She looked up then, eyes growing wide. So, perhaps, in the same way, the witch uses reflections to not only travel through space, but through time. The other two were silent for a long moment.
You mean I didn't just forget? Jacqueline said at last. I simply skipped those years altogether?
Belle pursed her lips, then nodded. I think so.
Giles scowled. I don't like this, he said frankly. I don't like this at all.
A shadow fell over her then. Belle looked up. The sun had fallen beneath the tree line, bathing the room in shadows. As it did, a feeling of déjà vu washed over her. Memories of sundials, of holding the mirror and looking into the past, of realizing it didn't have to show her the present moment alone. Of course, she whispered, She'd been so focused on finding where Adam was now, she had completely forgotten to make use of the mirror's ability to show her things from the past. She held the mirror up, staring at it for it and thinking hard. It could show her the past, but what question to ask? I feel like there should be something from the past that can help us find them, she said. But what? Jacqueline rubbed her temple as she thought, just like Adam did. Then she looked up. The enchantress did say something. That she hated these woods, which struck me as odd. Perhaps that could help. Belle looked back towards the mirror. Can you show me what made the enchantress hate these woods? She tried. The mirror remained blank, and Belle hummed. The witch had blocked other questions about herself, it seemed. She grit her teeth, but tried again. Is there anything from the enchantress's past you can show me? She asked. Anything from the past that could help us? Belle had nearly given up on the question when the mirror began to glow. Jacqueline gasped beside her, and Giles moved over for a look. Belle watched with wide eyes. She couldn't have anticipated what she'd see next. Within a candle-lit tent, a small, ancient woman sat cross-legged on the floor. Beneath her lay a worn rug, woven with patterns of plum blossoms and intricate winding shapes. She sat on a thin cushion, hands propped up on a low table, on which rested a mirror with a bright, silver-carved handle. The tent flap opened, and a small head peeked inside. The old woman grinned. Come in, child. A girl, barely more than skin and bones, stepped hesitantly through the opening. She was pale-eyed, hair that had once been blonde now grimy and matted against her neck. In one arm she held a basket filled with vibrant, blooming roses. Rose, madame? The child asked quietly. She stared over the woman's head, focusing absently on a point across the room. The woman raised a brow. Oh my! And where did you find such beautiful flowers in the middle of winter? The girl's eyes grew wide, and she began to back away. Don't be frightened. I mean no harm, the old woman said. In fact, I've been expecting you, little one. Me? The old woman hummed in agreement. Now, though I have no coin, I would be willing to give you your fortune for a single rose. The girl's eyes brightened, and she nodded. Setting down her basket, she felt for the table and sat herself on the cushion opposite the old fortune-teller. What is your name, little one? She asked. The girl hesitated, but after a moment she answered. Circe. The woman brought her hands together and ducked her head. An interesting name indeed. I myself was given none at birth, though my first master did call me Huniliang. Huini? Circe tried, scrunching up her face. The woman only laughed. It is all right, young mademoiselle. Most of your people cannot speak it either. Instead, you may call me Agatha. Agatha? The child asked. Why? Both names mean good, Agatha explained. She chuckled to herself, and I try to live up to it. Circe cocked her head, but didn't reply. Picking up the mirror, Agatha touched its surface and watched the image. Before looking ahead, it was always best to look into the past, which she did now. It showed the girl before her, standing in the woods, overcome with fatigue and falling asleep on the cold ground. A bright circle surrounded her, forming a wall of roses that grew up and around her as she slept. The plants were dense, shielding the child from the winds and hiding her from curious predators. The image changed, a flash of scenes passing the mirror's surface. It showed the girl growing, slowly finding her way to this city, teaching herself to cultivate the beautiful roses, and selling them for a living in the streets of Paris. Ah, Agatha spoke at last, just as I thought. She paused, willing the vision to move ahead. Now it showed a smiling Circe beside Agatha herself, one small hand reaching forth and glowing, though the image soon disappeared. Fate was never certain, after all, and anything could happen. but for now the future seemed bright enough. "What is it?" Circe asked nervously, after waiting some time with no explanation. "What do you see?" Smiling, Agatha lowered the mirror and looked into the child's cloudy eyes.
"You are like me," she whispered.
"Like you?" Circe asked, frowning. She looked suspicious. Agatha leaned forward.
"You can work magic, can you not?"
Circe gasped, still staring absently at a point just past the old enchantress's shoulder. I think so. You can too?"
Agatha grinned again. "Indeed, I can. For I am known by yet another name. The Enchantress of the East."
She paused, cocking her head.
"Would you like to see?"
Circe frowned, eyes narrowing in distrust as she stared at the table between them.
"I won't hurt you," Agatha promised. "But if you do not wish to see—"
"No!" Circe asked quickly. "I'm sorry. I want you to show me." Nodding, Agatha reached forward and held the child's hand tight. In an instant, the fog in her eyes faded, showing the bright, emerald green eyes beneath. Circe blinked once, then twice, now staring straight at Agatha's face. She breathed, looking around the small space in amazement. "I can see!" Agatha smiled, feeling a surge of power build in her chest.
"Yes, child. I am glad."
Circe stared at her hands, turning them over twice, and then picking up one of the long roses from her basket and smiled. "It's so pretty," she said to herself. Agatha watched her for a moment.
"Yes, it is," she said. "But don't let your new eyes deceive you, child, for beauty is found within."
Circe didn't seem to hear her, touching the soft petals of the flower and smiling ear to ear. Agatha chuckled, reaching for her hand again.
"Now, I promised you a fortune, did I not?"
Circe blinked and then nodded.
"I see myself becoming your teacher," Agatha said, "or Sifu in my home tongue."
"Sifu," Circe repeated.
"Very good. That's an easy one."
Agatha smiled.
"In fact, in time, you can hone your magic to say my real name, too, and any word in any language you wish."
"Really? Even without practice?"
"Mm-hmm," Agatha said. "I am using such a power to speak to you now."
Circe's mouth formed a small O in surprise.
"There is much to learn, but I would be happy to teach you,"
Agatha went on.
"It has been many years since I have seen another of our kind, and I have never had my own apprentice before. It could be quite an adventure."
The corner of Circe's mouth curled up at that. "You'll take me away from this place?"
"I would indeed prefer it," Agatha replied.
Circe paused a minute, another flash of distrust crossing her eyes, but in the end she nodded her head. "Okay," she said simply. Just then they heard a commotion outside the tent. Men were yelling above the sounds of the others, packing up their wares and rushing down the street. "The police!" Circe said in fear. "We have to go! They don't like us here!" Before she could finish, the tent flap had flown open. 2 tall men stormed in, and one caught Circe by the arm.
"You," he said. "We've been looking for you, filthy urchin. Florist ain't happy you've been stealing his roses."
"I didn't steal them!" Circe cried, tugging in vain against his hold.
"Sure you didn't,"
the other said, looking over the tent in disgust and straightening his wide-brimmed hat.
"Ugh, vagabonds and foreigners. We ought to burn this district to the—"
He stopped, and in a heartbeat disappeared. His hat sat suspended in the air for a long moment, then flopped to the ground. Circe stared at the scene in disbelief, then turned quickly as the man beside her disappeared the same way. His coat was all that remained, piling atop the rug in a heap.
"Where do they expect the poor to live, I wonder?"
Agatha said. She pulled back a hand, which still glowed faintly in the dark room, and touched the rug where she sat. It shrank in an instant, along with the small table and the other little trinkets lining the tent. Agatha gathered them into the palm of her hand, placing them deep in the pocket of her robes. Then, standing onto tired old feet, she picked up the silver mirror and turned back to her new apprentice.
Shall we go, then? She offered, reaching out a hand. They won't stay like that for long, after all.
Circe was still staring at her, unblinking. Then, after a moment of hesitation, she walked over and gripped Agatha's old, wrinkled fingers. Agatha handed the mirror's handle tight, letting the object grow. Once it was large enough for the two of them, she turned back to the girl.
It's been some time before I was in my own land. Shall we go there first?
Circe only nodded, gripping her fingers tighter. The glass began to change, showing a landscape of greens and golds. Agatha smiled broadly, feeling younger than she had in decades.
Then let's be off.
Sifu, why can we do magic? It was one of the forgotten villages of rural China. Agatha sat with her new apprentice near the top of a short ridge, looking over the rolling hills. The rice terraces were bright green beneath the sun. A dozen workers in wide-brimmed hats bent over and spotting the winding rows. It had been but a day since they had arrived, and Circe had sat watching the scene before them with a long time. The world and its beauty still new to her eyes.
I don't know why some are blessed with magic and others not, Agatha admitted, but I do know how it manifests in those who are.
How? Circe asked, finally looking up at her.
Across the world, children are... She stopped.
She was going to say abandoned, but didn't want to upset the child now watching her with wide eyes.
Children are lost every day, she said. It is in that instance that powers, if present, will manifest to protect them.
Circe looked at her feet. Like when Papa left, she stated. My roses protected me. Agatha nodded sadly. Perhaps she didn't need to hide the truth after all.
Yes, but there is much more you can do than that.
Circe's eyes brightened, and she looked back up. Like what? Agatha stood, and Circe followed, bouncing on her toes in anticipation.
There are 3 main methods you may use to avoid danger.
Agatha began.
Let's start with the first.
She held up a finger and gave it a flick.
Step forward, Circe.
The girl did as she was told, but stopped before she could take a step. Hey! She frowned, feeling the air before her. I can't go through.
Indeed,
Agatha said, flicking one finger and racing the wall again.
A hidden wall.
It can secure your shelter from intruders, or simply protect you from anyone who may mean you harm. This is the first method, and is often the best way to avoid trouble in the first place. Circe's eyes brightened further. What else? She asked eagerly. Agatha hummed in amusement. The child was certainly eager. She pulled the hand mirror from her robes and handed it to Circe.
Hold this, and please don't drop it.
Circe nodded, and Agatha reached forward and touched the handle.
Contain me, she commanded.
In an instant her body disappeared. Sifu? Circe asked, looking around the empty road and starting to panic. Sifu, come back! She sobbed.
I'm not gone, Circe, she said calmly. I'm in your very hands.
Circe gasped, looking down. You're in the mirror?
Agatha laughed. Release me, she ordered,
and found herself back on her feet. Circe looked at her with eyes as round as saucers.
That's a fun trick, is it not?
Circe nodded, starting to smile. That's like what you did to those mean men.
Agatha chuckled, but went on. If perchance you need to hide, you may do so, with any object of your choosing, as I have done here. And yes, you may also cast the spell upon others. They'll inhabit whatever they are touching while you flee.
Wow, Circe said in awe, her lips grew into a lopsided smile. That could be kind of funny too, huh?
Now, don't get any ideas.
Circe only grinned wider, looking back in the mirror in amazement, before back up at her teacher. And the last way?
You've already seen it, child, Agatha said. It's how we came here. After all, when all else fails, seek your own reflection, and you can escape.
Circe nodded. Then she turned around, looking over the green fields once again. It was several minutes before she spoke. Sifu, she asked quietly, what happened to you?
To me?
The girl nodded. You said magic comes to those who are lost. Were you lost too? Agatha stared over the landscape, an old hurt in her chest.
These people, like much of the world, often fail to see the worth of a deformed child, she explained.
She looked back down, smiling sadly.
I was left on the road, not too far from here.
Circe frowned. Deformed?
I was born with a misshapen lip, Agatha explained, pointing to an old scar. I have long since healed it, though I kept the mark to remind myself of my origins. Fortunately, another of our kind found me and cared for me until I could do so myself.
So, did you sell roses too?
Agatha smiled. No, little one. I told fortunes. We may share many powers, but we each have those unique to us as well.
Circe pouted, reaching into her pocket and pulling forth a single rose. It seemed to have bloomed there of its own accord. Quite impressive, though the girl herself only looked disappointed. Seeing the future seems a lot better than flowers, she huffed.
Agatha chuckled. I can't see everything, Circe. The future is always changing, after all. And, who knows, she said with a grin. There may be more to those roses than meets the eye.
Sifu, what are we doing here? Agatha held her rose up in two hands, stepping carefully across several old boards laid in the mud to form a path through the village. While perhaps calling it mud was being generous. Circe followed behind, holding her nose in one hand and the bundle of her skirt in the other.
Before you can learn anything new, you must learn how to grow and store your magic, Circe explained.
Circe looked around, raising her brow. Okay. They reached a small hut and entered quietly. The room was filled with far too many people than should have been possible, lying in heaps and breathing raspy, dying breaths. Agatha knelt down and rolled up her sleeves.
Where do you think our magic comes from, Circe? She whispered,
though it wouldn't matter if the others heard. These people were far too ill to make sense of her words. Circe shrugged. I don't know. Agatha reached out, touching the hand of a small boy near their feet. His skin regained its rich colour in an instant, and soon he was awake and staring up at them with dark eyes.
Magic is nothing but love in a new form, Agatha explained.
Circe raised a brow. Agatha hummed, moving on to the boy's mother.
The great and beautiful irony of life is the more we give of ourselves, the more we gain back, she said. Such is true for all people. But for you and I, it goes further. For when we express love, our magic itself strengthens.
Now Circe looked interested. Really? She asked eagerly. So if I learn to heal people, I'll get stronger?
Healing is how I choose to care for the world, Agatha explained, but love comes in many forms. You may find your own preferred method.
Circe pursed her lips, but nodded.
From our beginnings, you and I were denied the love no child should live without, Agatha went on solemnly. But if we can prove to love others in spite of this, we are rewarded greatly. Do you understand?
Circe narrowed her eyes. I guess. Agatha sensed the child's doubts, but didn't push the issue. It may take time to help her understand, but she had high hopes her newest student would come to see the truth in time. Sifu, look at this! Agatha pressed the pestle into the mix once more, scraping the spices over their dinner over the fire before turning around. Instead of her apprentice, a dark-haired woman stood before her. She was one of the younger mothers from the village, though in a second she glowed and grew into another form. The form of her apprentice, now a 15-year-old with long golden hair and already several inches taller than herself.
Circe!
Agatha said in shock.
How did you manage this?
Circe smirked. It was easy. I just held her hand while saying goodbye, and somehow I could feel her form come into me.
Agatha wasn't sure why, but she felt uneasy. That is quite advanced, Circe.
Circe only grinned further. And fun. I met her husband on the way back. He kissed me flat on the mouth. She laughed.
Circe!
Agatha cried in shock, rising to her feet. She couldn't believe her ears.
How can you laugh at such a thing? That is someone's form, someone's life you have stolen. How dare you abuse such power?
Ugh. Circe rolled her eyes and turned away. You're just jealous you can't do the same. Agatha stared at Circe, at a loss for words. Did she even know the girl who stood before her anymore? When she finally managed to speak, her words were empty and cold.
You will not perform such a spell again, she ordered. Do you understand?
Circe looked back, wrinkling her nose, but her features soon relaxed, and she stared at the floor in defeat. Fine. A year passed, and then another, and Circe's power only grew stronger. Unnaturally strong. In some ways, Agatha was proud of her. She had remained obedient, abiding to her lessons with diligence. But the old enchantress couldn't shake the feeling that her pupil was hiding something. So, one night, she pulled the hand mirror from her pocket and asked to see Circe's future once again. She hadn't looked in years, for a reason she couldn't explain. Perhaps she was afraid to know. It was a mistake to wait for so long, however, for what she saw was anything but the bright future she had hoped for. The mirror's predictions were always based on an individual's current path, their current choices. And if what she saw now was right, Circe was involved in something terrible. Minutes later, Agatha was out back, throwing open their small storage shed. Inside she found a couple, mouth to mouth, the man's tunic held tightly in the young woman's grip, a dozen roses blooming in her hair. Releasing him at the sound, the girl looked back and narrowed her eyes. They glowed a pale red in the darkness.
Circe!
Agatha breathed, for she knew it was her. She had seen as much in the mirror.
What have you done?
Circe's body returned to its original shape and form, though her eyes remained that same strange red. She let the man fall limp to the ground. You told me to find a form of love to strengthen my powers. Circe shrugged. Well, I found one.
This isn't love, Circe.
Agatha whispered, old limbs trembling in sorrow and betrayal.
This is lust.
But it makes me so much stronger than anything else can, Circe insisted. Besides, he's a known thief.
That doesn't matter, Agatha said. And while you may feel stronger now, it will never last.
She took a step forward, looking up close into those strange red eyes.
The eyes tell all. You cannot hide what you are becoming,
she said solemnly.
Dark magic always bears a mark, Circe. You must stop this, or it will consume you.
Circe stared right back at her, red eyes full of rage. No, she snarled. I won't let you hold me back any longer. Agatha watched her for a long moment.
How could she have let this happen? How did she not foresee this long ago? You've gone behind my back,
she said, closing her eyes. It hurt to do, but she went on.
You've twisted everything I've taught you, and as such, I can no longer be your teacher.
Circe's expression changed in an instant. You're going to leave me, she whispered, eyes growing wide and desperate. Just like he did.
Leave you?
Agatha asked, looking up quickly.
Circe, I never said.
Well, I won't let you, she said, eyes burning with tears, because I'm leaving you first. She looked around, and in an instant spotted a barrel of water beside her, moonlight spilling through its roof, allowing a small reflection in its surface.
Circe! Agatha gasped. Child, wait! But it was too late. For the moment Circe's fingertips touched its surface, she disappeared. Sucking in a breath, Agatha looked back at her old mirror, still tight in one grip. Show me the girl, she ordered. Yet, for the first time, her magic failed to work. Circe's powers were stronger than she'd realized. She must be hiding herself from her sight. Oh no! Oh no! Agatha breathed, reaching a trembling hand to her heart. What have I done? Circe found her 5 years later, and much too late. Circe! The form on the ground paused in her feast. Circe looked up, eyes now a vibrant red, fingers soaked in blood. Don't call me that. Agatha stared at the scene in horror. You're a murderer. So is he, Circe said absently. Besides, the heart is the greatest source of love, isn't it? She asked, lips curling up into a wicked grin as she looked down into the man's empty chest. Agatha stared at her, barely seeing the girl who had once been inside. She felt her old bones tremble with rage. You are blinder now than the day I found you. Circe stood, flicking the blood from her fingers and cocking her head. And what are you going to do about it, old hag? I am going to stop you, Agatha said. She raised her hands, feeling her fingers swell with power. I am going to stop the monster I have created. Monster? Circe rasped. Her cheeks grew grey and hollow, eyes bright with rage, and in an instant she disappeared into the darkness. Agatha pulled back, eyes wide as she looked around. This wasn't good. Where had the girl learnt such a trick? Closing her eyes, Agatha felt for any source of power around her, yet the air seemed to be brimming with nothing but death and darkness, and soon it overwhelmed all her senses. And before she could get her bearings again, there was a hand at her throat. The sharp nails, wrist and arm appearing a moment later. Circe's fingers cold against her skin. Didn't see this coming, fortune teller, she whispered into her ear. How interesting. You've grown weak. Agatha grit her teeth, but lowered her arms all the same. You should have done what I did, you know, Circe went on. Given up your foolish pride and gained power like I do. Perhaps then you would have stood a chance against me. Agatha scowled. If you're going to kill me, then be done with it, girl, she said darkly. I wish another had years ago, before I ever had the chance to find you. Circe hissed, her grip tightening around her old master's throat. She breathed heavily for a long minute, and Agatha waited in silence, knowing she wouldn't die now. No, Circe wouldn't wait so long unless she felt certain. I don't plan on killing you, Circe said at last with an air of false confidence. In fact, I think I'll take you with me. Now it was Agatha who disappeared, not of her own accord, but by a spell cast from Circe's fingertips. Every inch of her gone in an instant, all but the dim hand mirror in her pocket, which fell at Circe's feet. The young woman laughed, leaning down and picking up the ancient object. How ironic. She turned the mirror over in her hands, now encasing her old master. I've not set a time limit for you, Agatha. You have no voice, no means of communication, but to the one who asks it of you, nor any way to escape. Circe paused, smirking, and tucking the mirror into her robes. Looks like I'm the enchantress of the East now, she went on, narrowing her eyes.
And with you out of my way, I think it's time to pay one Prince of France a visit."
"Oh my goodness,"
Jacqueline breathed as the image disappeared. "Her teacher!" Belle gasped. She trailed off, recalling the very first time she had seen this mirror, holding the glowing object beside Adam in his chambers.
"The mirror isn't one of us, Belle,"
he had said with a laugh. Belle's mouth grew dry. She stared at the dim mirror in her hands, mind racing. All of these visions, they seemed different than anything else she had seen. All from one perspective. Agatha's perspective. Belle's eyes grew wide. These weren't visions at all, but memories. Adam had been wrong. "Agatha! Show us yourself!" Belle cried, staring at the object in earnest. The object, for the first time, trembled in her hands. Belle dropped it to the rug in surprise, where it glowed fiercely. She shaded her eyes, sensing Adam's mother do the same. A sharp sound rang off the walls, likely Giles releasing his sword. Belle had barely opened her eyes again, when she was encased in two small but strong arms.
"Belle, my dear child!" a voice cried out. "You've done it!"
Belle stared into the wrinkled face as it pulled back. Two dark, twinkling eyes staring at her, lip curling back to reveal a mouth with several missing teeth. Said mouth was soon pressed against one of Belle's cheeks, and then the other, cackling joyfully as she pulled away. You're... Belle stammered. "You're Agatha!"
"Another witch?"
Giles said fiercely, pushing the woman away and standing between them with his sword aloft.
"We've had enough of your kind around here."
"Giles!" Belle cried in shock. "What are you doing?"
"It could be another trick," he explained, narrowing his eyes. "All of that. All to make us trust her."
"Oh, Giles," Jacqueline said with surprising calm. "We do love your diligence, but aren't you being a bit rash? She seems safe enough to me." She smiled. Giles looked perplexed at that, flushing in spite of himself. He sighed, pulling away.
"You were always so generous, my queen,"
he said in defeat, sliding his sword back into his belt. Agatha, for her part, simply chuckled. "Don't worry, I'll forgive the handsome commander." Giles blanched. Belle caught his small groan as he ran a hand down his face. Chuckling again, Agatha bent at the waist, touching her toes, before raising her hands as high in the air as they would go. They would have barely reached Belle's chin if she had been standing. "Oh, I am stiff as a board!" she exclaimed before shaking a tiny and very unthreatening fist in no particular direction.
"That wretched girl!
She'll be sorry." Belle started. Agatha was beside her again in a moment, cupping Belle's face in old, wrinkled hand.
Yes, we must get your prince back,"
she said earnestly, patting Belle's cheek twice before turning towards Jacqueline.
"And your king. Yes, it is quite time, I say."
Belle blinked, absently wondering if all that time in the mirror hadn't made the old enchantress a bit eccentric. Sifu Agatha, she recalled. "Do you think—" "Oh, no, child. I am Nana to you." Belle cocked her head. "Nana?" she asked in confusion. Agatha raised one thin, trembling finger and grinned.
"Granny."
Yes, perhaps a bit eccentric, Belle decided. She smiled, also deciding she didn't mind one bit. "Nana, I was just wondering," she went on, do you think you could look and see where Adam is?" Agatha hummed, turning serious.
"My dear child, that's what I have been showing you already."
"But that was only mist," Belle said in confusion.
"Yes, Circe has limited even my visions of your young prince, it seems."
Belle looked into her lap, feeling no small tinge of disappointment.
"However," Agatha went on, "you were quite right about it being a fog. Quite clever. I was hoping you might catch that. And you have already determined the sunrise times, I believe."
Belle looked up. "We're still working on it, but so far it appears to be close. Perhaps a location along the coast of France, or the British Isles, or perhaps up into Norway, on the wet western mountainsides and valleys. The professor says anything further south is too dry to sustain a fog like that so constantly.
Giles stepped forward. There are several old fortresses in those regions, he said, abandoned for decades, even centuries now. I came across one or two in my past travels. Perhaps she has taken a hold of one of those.
If so, there should be ample records of such in our library, Jacqueline added. On the 4th level eastern balcony, I believe. Though we should check the index as well. Belle looked at the Queen in awe, and then remembered her first moments in the library with Adam.
The most recent rulers did much of the work themselves, he said, as they discussed the large index, for they had a passion for it. Even if we find such, my dear,
Giles went on, looking back at Belle. He rested a hand on her shoulder and spoke carefully.
I must warn you that an exploration of these locations could take many long months, if not years.
But we still have the records of the men missing and murdered, Belle said, anxious not to fall into despair again. That could limit our search too, right? Agatha, strangely, chuckled at them.
Quite a clever lot indeed. But, child, you forget.
She stopped, plopping herself on the rug by their feet. She crossed her legs and rested 2 old hands on her knees, before cocking her head at them.
You have a power beyond books and figures now.
Belle frowned. I do? Agatha beckoned her over, and Belle moved off the bed and knelt on the floor beside her. Agatha reached out one finger, making Giles flinch, but simply rested the tip over Belle's heart.
Ah, yes, I feel it there,
the old enchantress spoke, closing her eyes.
The string of fate.
Belle looked down, then back up in confusion. What do you mean?
It is an effect of Circe's spell, Agatha went on, opening her eyes and pulling away. No doubt unknowns to her. The more your love for the young prince grew, the stronger the cord became. With the curse broken, it was made firm and immovable.
Belle stared at her unblinking. Agatha then leaned close.
Think of him, she said quietly, the one you want to see.
Belle finally blinked, then nodded. She closed her eyes.
Now, Agatha whispered, find him in your mind's eye, and feel him in your heart.
Sucking in a breath, Belle pictured Adam, letting her love and aching for him flood her chest. And in an instant, something was tugging on it, almost imperceptibly. But the more she focused, the more she could feel it, like a small string wrapped around her heart and pulling her forward. I feel it, Belle breathed. She opened her eyes and gasped. A thin, silvery string was spilling from her chest, pooling on the floor and winding its way across the room and over the window pane. It shimmered once, twice, and then disappeared again.
It will lead you to him,
Agatha explained. Belle looked back at her, heart swelling with hope.
You know your path now, child, she said with a grin. Now follow it!
End of chapter. Hi guys, hope you enjoyed that one. Oh my god, my throat is sore. And yes, I loved that backstory, and watching, you could tell, even from a young age, Circe's slow descent into that darkness. And Agatha, oh, she's a fun character. She kind of reminds me of a nice version of Mad Madam Mim, if you know The Sword in the Stone. Yeah, but anyway, you guys know the drill. Like, comment and subscribe, and hit that bell to get notified whenever I upload a new video. Have a good day, night, or whatever time zone you're in. Take care, my guys, gals, and non-binary pals. I'll see you in another video. Bye!